The most damning indictment of American innovation policy isn't coming from foreign competitors or academic studies. It's coming from America's own tech workers, researchers, and entrepreneurs who discovered that building the future had become easier, more predictable, and more rewarding in Canada than in the country that invented Silicon Valley. I've been analyzing innovation ecosystems and technological competitiveness for decades, and I can tell you that the exodus of American tech talent to Canada represents something unprecedented in the history of global innovation. Not just because highly skilled workers are relocating internationally, which has always happened for better opportunities, but because they're abandoning American innovation centers to escape American institutional dysfunction that makes long-term technological development impossible. The public story, as it's been covered in tech media and industry publications, focuses on routine talent mobility and competitive recruitment. Companies announce new research facilities, universities expand international partnerships, and governments launch innovation initiatives. Standard development language that usually masks the uncomfortable reality that American technological leadership is being undermined not by foreign competition, but by domestic chaos that drives away the people who create the future. But what's actually happening in research labs, startup incubators, and innovation centers across America is far more consequential than any diplomatic press release suggests. America's brightest minds are making individual decisions that collectively add up to a technological earthquake. They're concluding that building breakthrough technologies, conducting long-term research, and creating scalable innovations requires the kind of institutional stability that American politics can no longer provide. To understand how devastating this transformation has been for American technological competitiveness, you have to understand what made American innovation dominant in the first place. It wasn't just venture capital or market size, though both played important roles. It was institutional predictability. Researchers could pursue multi-decade projects with confidence that funding frameworks, immigration policies, and regulatory environments would remain stable enough to justify massive intellectual investments. That institutional predictability has evaporated. When research funding can disappear based on political calculations, when immigration policies change without warning via executive orders, when regulatory frameworks shift based on social media announcements, innovation planning becomes impossible. Scientists and engineers who need to make decade-long commitments to breakthrough research can't operate in an environment where the rules change faster than research cycles. The artificial intelligence sector provides perhaps the clearest example of how this institutional chaos translated into innovation exodus. AI development requires enormous investments in talent, infrastructure, and long-term research programs. When companies can't predict whether their international researchers will be able to remain in the country, when funding priorities shift with every election, when regulatory approaches to AI change based on political messaging rather than scientific understanding, innovation relocates to more stable environments. Canada offered something that American innovation culture could no longer provide: boring institutional reliability. Canadian immigration policy doesn't reverse direction every election cycle. Canadian research funding operates through established scientific processes rather than political calculations. Canadian regulatory frameworks maintain consistency across government transitions. For innovators who need to plan decades in advance, boring became revolutionary. The biotechnology sector followed similar patterns, but with even more dramatic implications for American scientific leadership. Biotech research requires not just institutional stability, but also predictable access to international talent, global research partnerships, and regulatory frameworks that support long-term clinical development. When American policies began treating international scientific cooperation as a security threat rather than a competitive advantage, biotech researchers faced impossible choices. Canadian research environments offered access to the same global scientific networks that American institutions had traditionally provided, but without the political volatility that made long-term collaborations unreliable. International researchers could commit to Canadian projects with confidence that policy changes wouldn't suddenly make their participation illegal or scientifically unviable. For research that depends on stable international partnerships, political stability became the determining factor. What makes this innovation exodus particularly tragic is how it affects the very technological progress that American economic competitiveness depends on. When breakthrough researchers relocate to escape American institutional chaos, they take their discoveries, their research programs, and their innovation potential with them. The technological foundations for future economic growth relocate along with the people who create them. The human dimension of this story is particularly heartbreaking because it affects people who had invested their entire careers in advancing American technological leadership. Computer scientists, biomedical researchers, materials engineers, and innovation entrepreneurs who had spent decades building expertise in American institutions discovered that their knowledge and creativity were most valuable in Canadian environments that offered the stability American institutions could no longer provide. Some of these innovators were able to relocate their entire research programs to Canadian institutions, but most had to abandon projects that had taken years to develop. Research that could have generated breakthrough technologies, medical treatments, or industrial innovations was simply discontinued because the institutional environment that supported it became too chaotic to sustain long-term intellectual investment. Canadian officials understood the opportunity this American dysfunction created and positioned themselves accordingly. Instead of trying to compete with American innovation through government programs or corporate incentives, they offered what American politics could no longer deliver: predictable institutional frameworks that allowed innovators to pursue long-term research with confidence that the rules governing their work would remain recognizable across electoral cycles. This approach proved more attractive than any research grant or tax incentive because it addressed the fundamental problem that was driving innovation exodus from America: uncertainty. When researchers can't predict what their funding status will be next year, when they can't plan international collaborations around stable visa policies, when they can't invest in long-term projects without knowing whether regulatory frameworks will remain consistent, they relocate to environments where such planning becomes possible. The broader economic implications of this innovation exodus extend far beyond individual research projects into questions about American technological leadership in the global economy. Innovation isn't just about producing new technologies, it's about maintaining the intellectual capacity that drives economic growth, supports advanced industries, and creates the high-value jobs that anchor prosperous communities. When that capacity relocates to escape domestic dysfunction, it takes with it the foundation for future economic competitiveness. From a strategic perspective, this represents a self-inflicted wound that will take decades to heal, even if American institutions eventually stabilize. Innovation ecosystems aren't just physical infrastructure and research facilities. They're intellectual communities, collaborative networks, and knowledge-sharing relationships. Once these communities relocate to other countries, rebuilding them requires not just financial investment, but trust and stability that may be difficult to restore. What's particularly striking about this crisis is how it reveals the gap between political rhetoric about American technological leadership and the reality of what innovators actually need to succeed. Political leaders talk about bringing innovation back to America while simultaneously creating the institutional instability that drives innovation away from America. The contradiction would be comical if the consequences weren't so serious for technological progress and economic competitiveness. Canadian innovation centers have experienced unprecedented growth during this period, not because Canadian researchers suddenly became more creative or productive, but because they could offer innovators what American institutions could not: the ability to focus on research rather than institutional survival. When regulatory compliance becomes predictable, when funding frameworks remain stable, when international collaboration isn't subject to sudden policy reversals, researchers can devote their intellectual energy to innovation rather than adaptation. The international dimension of this innovation exodus has profound implications for global technological development and economic relationships. When American innovation capacity contracts due to institutional dysfunction rather than intellectual decline, it signals to international partners that the United States may no longer be a reliable foundation for long-term technological cooperation. Countries and companies begin designing innovation strategies that work without American participation rather than with it. This shift is already visible in how major technology corporations structure their global research operations. Instead of treating American facilities as headquarters operations that coordinate international research networks, they're treating American operations as regional facilities within networks coordinated from more stable jurisdictions. When the innovation hub becomes less reliable than its international nodes, the network reorganizes itself around a new center of gravity. The technological implications are equally concerning for American innovation leadership. Advanced research increasingly requires integration between basic science, applied research, and technological development. When research capacity relocates to escape American institutional instability, it often takes associated innovation ecosystems with it, because proximity between discovery and development provides competitive advantages that distance cannot replicate. This means that the innovation exodus isn't just about losing research jobs, it's about losing the intellectual capacity that creates the next generation of technologies and industries. When breakthrough research follows stability to more predictable institutional environments, American technological leadership erodes in ways that affect every sector of the economy, not just the research programs that relocate directly. The most sobering aspect of this entire crisis is how completely avoidable it was. The institutional frameworks for maintaining innovation competitiveness weren't exotic or impossible to preserve. They just required the kind of political discipline that prioritizes long-term technological progress over short-term political advantage. Other developed countries maintained innovation capacity by maintaining institutional stability. America chose chaos and got the predictable result. For observers trying to understand how technological leadership shifts in the global economy, the American innovation exodus offers important lessons about the relationship between institutional stability and intellectual productivity. Innovation requires massive long-term investments in human capital that can only be justified in stable institutional environments. When institutions become unreliable, innovation becomes unsustainable, regardless of other competitive advantages. As this exodus continues, what becomes clear is that restoring American innovation competitiveness will require not just policy changes, but institutional restoration that may take decades to achieve. Innovation capacity can relocate quickly when conditions become unfavorable, but rebuilding that capacity requires time, trust, and consistency that must be demonstrated over extended periods. The technological revolution that made America dominant didn't happen overnight, and neither will any restoration of that dominance. The innovation exodus represents more than a technological setback. It represents a verdict on American institutional competence rendered by the people who create the future. When American innovators conclude that America is no longer the best place to build breakthrough technologies, it's not just an indictment of specific policies. It's a judgment on the entire approach to governance that treats institutional stability as disposable rather than foundational. And once that judgment is rendered by the minds that shape technological progress, reversing it becomes exponentially more difficult than preventing it would have been.